So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that when you get to the end of a diet, especially like people who have gotten very, very lean, the inclination can be to want to eat all of the foods that you had to restrict yourself from during the prep. Because even if you're flexible dieting, you're not gonna be able to flexible diet and have cheesecake near the end of a contest prep. Like it's just not, maybe about like that much. So what tends to happen is people, since they can now have those, they want to have all of them, and they're not really able to moderate their intake well. I mean, basically, the research says that it's better than sex in terms of a reward.
And welcome to a new episode of IG Life with Astrid, your APD. I am so thrilled today because Layne is joining me for our rapid Q&A, true and false, overrated, underrated, this or that, and this is going to be epic. So guys, put any questions you've got there. Let's roll. I am so excited that we are the men. Woo! So put some likes, some hearts.
Hey Astrid, how are you?
Very good. Very excited to see you.
Good to see you too.
I think we need to get rolling because there's like a bunch of questions I need to ask you. It is going to be like this. There are 3 categories: true and false, overrated, underrated, this or that. I'll kind of say a statement, and you're going to say yes, true or false, and then sort of give me a little bit of a rationale why you're picking that answer. You ready?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, so the first category is going to be true or false. I'm going to say a statement. The first one is, you don't want a fast metabolism. You want a flexible metabolism. True or false?
That's tough. It depends on the goal, unfortunately. Since everybody out there is I'll say false, that most people want a fast metabolism because most people watching are concerned with body composition. But I will say that a fast metabolism is usually a flexible metabolism as well in terms of energy expenditure. So I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive.
Okay, second one. You should track artificial sweetener, diet sodas, spices, and every single thing you find in your way in a fat loss phase. True or false?
Because what are you tracking? There's no caloric value. If you wanted to track like sodium or something like that to look at water fluctuations, I guess you could. But unless you just want to drive yourself insane with tracking every single, compound you're putting in your body, that sounds like a recipe for neuroticism. So, false.
When you want to get into a level of very detail, let's say contest prep, would your approach change, especially if you want to really make sure everything that the athlete is eating or consuming is making a difference in the body composition, especially if someone really likes something? Let's say you're utilizing artificial sweeteners not just once, but a few times in a day. Or if you're using spices not just once, but a few times in a day. Would just a little bit every time add up and kind of could make a difference? Or you wouldn't still get into that nitty gritty?
Yeah, I know. If there was something that had that, the only thing I could think about, like possibly tracking in terms of that, would be, for example, like just trying to understand weight fluctuations better. Like maybe sodium or fiber. But even then, I'm going to be much more inclined to just focus on the big rocks. This isn't impact body composition. People doing contest prep have enough stuff to think about. I think trying to simplify it would be way better.
Totally agree. Now, third question. The third statement is, food addiction is a real thing. And this is a very common statement for a lot of people, especially when we post about carbohydrates or high palatable foods. What do you think is this in this statement? Is it true or is it false?
False, based on our most current understanding of the food literature. Now, what there does appear to be good evidence for is what's called food dependence. Now, that might sound like the same thing, but they have some subtle differences to them. Food dependence is more that you have tied your stress response to certain foods. and that you use food as a coping mechanism. And so that does appear to be a real thing. And, people will say, well, sugar is addictive or whatever it is. Actually, the foods that tend to score the highest on a food dependence test are foods that are high in sugar and fat. Not just, most people aren't binge eating honey. Like they're not taking the bag of sucrose and just holding it over their mouth and going like this. They're eating donuts and cookies and cakes and ice cream and baked goods, all of which are highly processed, hyperpalatable foods that are just easy to overeat. And it could be that those foods don't even have a higher risk of dependence inherent to them. It's that people tend to associate those foods with comfort. And so it kind of creates this vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's like a reward. Now I am using this as a reward to make me feel good. So because it feels good, you sort of establish a relationship with certain foods that you sort of tend to pick by default, rather than obviously picking a potato or a carrot. That is probably not going to give you that pleasure sensation.
Right. And, one thing to keep in mind is people say, well, this, if you give sugar, this part of the brain lights up. Yeah. It also lights up when you get a hug. I don't think that people have an addiction to hugs. So, you've got to be very careful with this mechanistic data. And yeah, I think that right now, I wouldn't say that there's strong evidence for food addiction. I think that there is relatively good evidence for some people having food dependence.
Yeah, perfect. The other statement is whole eggs are a concern for your total cholesterol. Should you stress about how much eggs do you eat in a day? True or false?
So true to the first statement, probably false to the second. So let me give an example. So eggs will raise your total cholesterol. However, they don't appear to have a negative impact on your LDL cholesterol, at least based on the research I've seen. And what I would say is that eggs are probably something that is a pretty nutritious food overall. And I've really seen a lot of data to suggest that people who eat lots of high egg intake have elevated LDL. So I would say that it's true that they will raise your total cholesterol, but total cholesterol doesn't appear to really be a risk factor for disease. It appears to be much more closely tied to LDL cholesterol and actually apolipoprotein B specifically.
What is your stance, just as a follow-up question for that one? When I've heard, I don't know if you agree with this statement, that all LDL particles are not the same. There are bigger particles of LDL that seem to be like a pattern A and a pattern B. And depending on the pattern, you are more likely to suffer from or have a higher risk of heart disease. If you have the pattern B, which is a little bit more of a irregular pattern, that your LDL particles are smaller and probably combined or glycated. Whereas if you have a pattern, just pure LDL or a pattern A, there is no such a higher risk, even if you have a high LDL. How much true is in this statement?
So this is a statement that's true, but it doesn't change the fact that LDL as a whole is a risk factor. So, and this is actually a really great red herring that a lot of LDL denialists use. So yes, small, dense LDL particles more easily can be oxidized and penetrate the endothelium, but they also carry less total cholesterol inside them. Large LDL particles can still penetrate the endothelium, though not as well as small, dense ones, but they carry more total cholesterol. The net effect of cholesterol deposition inside the endothelium seems to be not really different between the two. So all things being equal, they appear to be similarly atherogenic. So I would say that yes, if you're talking about the same total amount of cholesterol with small dense LDL, yeah, it per particle or per weight may be more atherogenic, but it carries less total cholesterol, and you're not equating for weight, you're equating for particle. They both appear to be similarly a risk factor for CVD.
The other follow-up question about that one is, if you let's say your only source of protein is eggs, financial situations, whatever it is, and that is the only food that is a protein source that you can access to, and you have more than 5 a day. The recommendations at the moment is about 7 a day from the Heart Foundation. Would you say that going over that might still be a risk if you were to eat that on a regular basis, based on a standard, adequate isocaloric diet, high protein, on a regular exercise? Should you be worried?
Well, as with anything in nutrition, it all depends on what you're replacing with, right? So if you're, taking out fish and replacing it with eggs, and whole eggs, and it's a low fat fish, then yeah, maybe it is a little bit of a risk factor. But if we're talking about like you're replacing, beef or, a T-bone steak with eggs, then probably not, because you're actually probably better off. So again, it's all about what you replace it with. And I do want to be clear, like, I'm not saying if you eat more than 7 eggs, you're in trouble or you're going to die or whatever. Like, it's a pretty small relative risk increase, but it does exist. So it's important to acknowledge. But I think what we should really focus on is the overall, what are you eating overall in a day, right? Like, what does your overall diet look like? I just did a consult about this with a person who was, very concerned about these different things for, Alzheimer's and whatnot. And I said, if you chase the small pebbles instead of the big rocks, you'll just feel like you're going around in circles. Because what you'll find is you can find that, fats are associated with different diseases, and carbs are associated with different diseases, and proteins are associated with different diseases. And every different nutrient you can think of is associated with some disease, is a risk factor for some disease. So let's focus on the big rocks first, and then if you want to chase the smaller pebbles, then more power to you.
Okay, totally agree. Now, another statement is, provided a diet is equated in calories and protein, better diet quality, more higher nutrient dense, will these have a superior effect on body composition changes just by having a better quality diet?
Is this true or
True or
false?
false?
Okay.
True or false?
True, maybe. So I would have said absolutely false 10 years ago. There are some isolated studies that I really want to see get replicated. So because there was a recent study that came out that did a nutrient-dense diet versus a nutrient-poorer diet, and they found that the nutrient-dense diet was better for fat loss and body composition. Now, if you read the paper, what you see is they didn't equate for protein and they didn't equate for fiber. Now, it's hard to equate nutrient density and equate fiber, but it's important because I think people don't understand the distinction. If people think, well, IIFYM, like these people are just eating candy bars and whatever. And I've always said, yeah, IIFYM, but with the caveat that you need to get enough fiber in, right? So, it's hard to get enough fiber in on a low quality diet, unless you're just pounding Benefiber or something like that. So I don't know because we haven't done those studies. The one thing I will say is there was a study done a while back, and I don't really know how to explain the results, but I got a plane going overhead. They substituted polyunsaturated fats for saturated fats. I forget exactly how much. Big fell, but interestingly, they saw a difference in body mass. So the group getting the polyunsaturated fats actually had higher levels of lean body mass than the group getting saturated fat. And I don't really know how to completely explain that. So I would like to see that study replicated just to see what happens.
Okay.
And
so it's kind of in between.
I just see that Potts Thinks got on here, which is cool because I just listened to her on a podcast with King of the Lift. So, hey. Sorry.
All right, next one. Mini cuts should be calculated and implemented differently between males and females. True or false?
True and false, and here's why. So true, because women have less lean body mass. They tend to have a higher percentage of body fat and lower daily overall energy expenditure. So yes, the absolute diet's going to look. But do I calculate it? Should you calculate it differently in terms of the methodology used? I don't think so. There's very, very little evidence that women. Let me back up. So I don't think women are just small men physiologically. However, nutritionally, there's not really much evidence that we need to program differently for women unless we're talking about like an athlete and we're trying to program the nutrition around their cycle a little bit differently so maybe they feel better. But in terms of physiological outcomes, not a whole heck of a lot of evidence. In fact, I would argue almost no evidence that you need to program differently for females versus males.
Okay. Why I say this is because I've always been hearing that females are a little bit more sensible and reactive to very aggressive calorie deficits. And that could be reflected on their hormonal state, their mood, or just by simply affecting their overall response. Like metabolically, they get a higher stress response, and probably that would affect somehow how they respond long term. Is it true?
I've seen no evidence to suggest that, so I'd say false. I think women
All
are
right.
having steeper calorie deficits because women are, on average, frankly, more likely to do dumb shit when it comes to diet. I hate to say it that way, but unfortunately, they tend to do crash diets more, fad diets more often, that sort of thing. So I think this is an issue of, the cart before the horse in terms of women don't necessarily need a greater calorie deficit. They just tend to go to one.
Yeah, totally agree. Now let's move to over and underrated. This is a very, very favorite of mine because we're going to state something that probably could be over or underrated. You can say that it's properly rated if you think that is fair, and explain why. So the first one is are deloads overrated or underrated?
Underrated.
Okay.
I think at least with most people I work with, trying to get them to back off is more work than trying to get them to push harder. So I think
okay.
the population I work with, it's underrated.
Okay. When a deload would be overrated?
When somebody's lazy. When somebody is already not pushing themselves hard enough.
Okay. So when it comes to implementing a deload, just a very tiny deviation here, how do you tend to implement it? Do you tend to pretty much recommend someone to just reduce volume, or do you consider reducing volume and intensity? Do you tend to suggest maybe just take a week, very light, off weight? What are your approaches when it comes to implementing a deload?
It depends on what their goal is. If they're a power lifter, like somebody who's actually going to compete in a strength sport, typically I'll reduce volume and load. If they are a bodybuilder, somebody who's doing it for hypertrophy reasons and not performance, I'll typically just reduce load from the perspective that usually a bodybuilder, there doesn't appear to be negative outcomes in terms of hypertrophy from, overreaching. People just tend to get really beat up and have, aches and pains and whatnot. So I'm typically going to reduce load first. If that's still not solving the issue, then I'll reduce volume as well. But typically for powerlifting, load and volume, bodybuilding, and then for your average person who's just looking to get a little bit stronger, usually I'll just reduce load, maybe a little bit of volume.
Okay, perfect. Now, reverse dieting, over or underrated?
Overrated. And that's going to be a big shock to a lot of people, considering I'm the one who popularized it. I think it's a great tool. I think it's a tool that can have a lot of benefits for people. But I think, unfortunately, and I'm guilty of this too, we tend to see like our hyper responders to reverse dieting, and we get really excited about this, and then we like post about those, and then people get the expectation that I'm going to add 1,000 calories to my diet and lose, 10 pounds of fat. Well, maybe, but probably not, right? So I do think it's become a little bit over. That doesn't mean I don't think it's a good tool. I think it's a good tool. It's something I use quite a bit, obviously, but I think people's expectations are overrated.
Okay. And when it comes to the differentiation between reverse and recovery diets, do you feel like when we are looking at or working with an athlete that just finished show day, contest prep, what is your preference when it comes to choosing whether the reverse diet is the best approach or being a little bit more aggressive with a recovery diet is a better approach?
So I think this comes down to like people talking past each other, and this has been happening for 10 years, ever since I started talking about reverse dieting, which is people say, well, Layne's saying people should stay in a deficit even after they've competed. and like slowly bring their calories back up to maintenance. What I've said is I think people should start at maintenance, but which maintenance are we talking about? Are we talking about their actual maintenance at that time, or are we talking about their predicted maintenance or their off-season maintenance? Because those are three very different things. And so this usually was like a debate between Alan Aragon and Eric Helms and I. There was actually like other people running the debate online. And it turns out we were all basically on the same page, that you start out at your actual maintenance for that time. And I actually recommend, usually, especially for somebody who's at an unsustainable body fat level, probably add 10, 20, or 30% on top of that, just depending on their tolerance for fat gain. And actually, what I'll do a lot of times is I'll be really aggressive for the first couple of weeks after a competition with people. I'll add, let them add quite a bit of weight back, not like a crazy amount, but get like 5 pounds, 6 pounds on them, and then I'll back way off, back off the gas pedal, and then let them slowly reverse from there, because now they're at a point that's a little bit more sustainable. They're feeling a little bit better, and then we can like do a slower reverse. And yeah, I used to do some conservative reverses, and I just found that, especially after contest prep where people's hunger signals are just so out of whack and crazy, very few people are able to adhere to that. It's probably not the best thing for them.
In that case, when we're looking at that dysregulated appetite, what are some of the main things that you tend to be very cautious about when you're recommending someone to increase their calories? They are going to be eating more. When it comes to like hedonic foods and highly palatable foods, now that you have more permission, you have more room for putting more calories in, there could be a fine line between what you eat and what leads to overeating, or maybe just that uncontrollable feeling like you need to eat more because you're starving, and on top of being starving, you're eating things that are creating you much higher food reward, and it could be just this fine line. So what would be your sort of caution, fine line, or boundary that you tend to implement with your clients to say, hey, there should be some guidelines or some boundaries before you just go YOLO?
Yeah, great question. And I see we got quite a few Team Byline coaches on there. What's up, guys? So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that when you get to the end of a diet, especially like people who have gotten very, very lean, the inclination can be to want to eat all of the foods that you had to restrict yourself from during the prep. Because even if you're flexible dieting, you're not going to be able to flexible diet and have cheesecake near the end of a contest prep. Like, it's just not, maybe not like that much, So what tends to happen is people, since they can now have those, they want to have all of them, and they're not really able to moderate their intake well, because it's just so, basically the research says that it's better than sex in terms of a reward. So listen, that's not me saying that. That's actual, like, the hedonic response is like that great. And anybody who's ever been that lean knows what I'm talking about. So what I usually tell people is just, I say, listen, you're going to get a chance to eat all the delicious foods you want. You don't have to have them all right now. So maybe, during a day, we're adding one new food, that you can try out or something like that, And again, I don't want to make hard rules, but I'll just kind of give them guidelines of, hey, listen, if you go too hard on this, it's going to be really hard to moderate. And first, don't need it, because you're going to get such a reward just from, having I don't know, cereal or, oatmeal or just basic foods you're going to get such a high reward from. So like you said, I think you kind of walk that staircase up of don't have a whole cheesecake, first thing right after your competition, because quite frankly, having a small bowl of ice cream is going to be 100 out of 100. Now you're just punching more dopamine you're not even going to get.
I agree. Now, next one is carbs for resistance and strength performance. Are they overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I actually think it's underrated. And I say that, I wouldn't have said this 10, 15 years ago, but because low carb has had such an incredible marketing behind it, people have not only been wary to eat carbohydrates, some people think that carbohydrates actually impede performance now, which is incredible to me. And it's really funny. I posted up a picture of me pretty lean. And I mentioned that I was eating almost 400 grams of carbohydrates a day. And somebody said, well, you train really hard. Of course you can eat that many carbohydrates. And I said, why do you think I can train really hard? Like, whereas you peter out in about 30 minutes. It's because I'm eating sufficient amount of carbohydrates. So I actually think they're underrated. If you look at the research literature, it's pretty clear that carbs are a great performance booster, to be honest. Now, that's not saying, like, there's a cap. It's not like, oh, I'm eating 200 grams of carbs, so I'm going to go up to 400 grams of carbs, and I'm going to get double the benefits. It's not how it works. Past a certain point, if you're having enough to, refill your glycogen and fuel your exercise, you don't need to have more than that necessarily, as long as you're meeting your energy requirement. But, if you're going, low carb, especially for things like resistance exercise and high intensity exercise, it's going to have a negative impact on your performance.
So based on that, would really love to hear your stance on with this recent systematic review that Menno Hesselmans published, pretty much stating that maybe eating too much carbs as what we thought once maybe is overrated, or maybe you don't need to use that much. You don't need as much as you thought you would. What are your stance in this paper? I don't know if you were able to get your hands in that paper, but basically it's saying you can eat carbs, there's nothing wrong with them, but you probably don't need as much as you thought you would.
I guess it depends on what people think they need. I actually haven't seen that paper, so I'd have to look at it. Some papers cut, low carb off as 40% of calorie carbohydrate. Well, for me, for example, I eat about 3,400. So 40%, that's 1,200. Hang on, let me just do, what is 40% of 3,400?
It's 1,360.
1,360 divided by 4. So that 40% of carbohydrate, 40% of calories from carbohydrate for me is 340 grams of carbohydrate. So, yeah, I think that's plenty. I don't need more than that. So you've really, and again, I haven't read the systematic review, but when you look at meta-analyses and systematic reviews, it's extremely important to look at the inclusion criteria, right? Because 40% may be considered low carb, but I don't think most people would consider 40% low carbohydrate, right? Yes, it may include some studies that are, way lower than that, but, it's also going to include some that aren't. So, again, I have to read the specific paper, but I think in general, making sure you have a sufficient amount of carbohydrate is important. Once you have a sufficient amount, I don't think adding more on top of that is necessarily needed other than just energy requirement. But I think me saying that they're underrated has more to do with how much carbohydrates have been demonized recently. Like I said, 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't have said underrated.
Okay. Next one, keeping relatively consistent number of meals, the time you eat in a day. Is that something that you consider that is overrated or underrated recommendation?
Underrated, actually. And I'm not a big proponent of meal timing or frequency necessarily, but I do think there is something to having similar meals or similar structure throughout a day. And it may be just completely psychological. It may have nothing to do physiological. People get into this diurnal rhythm and your biorhythm and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure that's not all complete bullshit. But I do think from a psychological perspective, we make so many decisions in a day. If you're having to decide at each meal, what am I going to have? That's just more to add to decision fatigue. So I do think, maybe have 1 or 2 meals a day that are flexible for you that you can determine. But I do think there's some benefit to having a few meals that are pre-planned, ready to go.
Okay. Like in terms of like thinking that if you have a more regular meal time or meal pattern, that probably helps also to teach your body when to be hungry and just have a little bit more regular, like your body is expecting to have meals at specific times. And so I guess this question also comes because there are people saying that if you want to train or be better at responding to hunger signals, you should be eating different times to surprise your ghrelin. So you train this hormone to just not be always expecting, or you always be expecting that you will be hungry. So what are your stance on this?
I think that's a lot of assumptions, a lot of tenuous assumptions. Uh, is it possible? Sure, but I'd say there's absolutely no data to suggest that that's helpful. Maybe it's helpful for some people, but I think as a population, I'm not sure that that has much relevance.
Perfect. Now, diet breaks, over or underrated?
Overrated, not because I don't
Okay.
or because I don't think they're great, but because of the way they've been marketed recently, and people saying that, oh well, you can boost your metabolism with a diet break and all that kind of stuff. Listen, there may be some small physiological benefits to diet breaks, but I think the overwhelming benefit to diet breaks is they allow you to, just the concept, you can structure your fat loss around your lifestyle. You don't have to feel like, okay, well, I have this fat loss phase, but I've also got a vacation coming up. Well, Tufsky Shitsky, I'm in a fat loss phase. Well, no, you can plan it so you take a maintenance week during that time and you structure around your lifestyle. So I think they're overrated because I think people have just hyped them up to be something that they're not because everybody's looking for the latest, greatest thing. Because what people don't want to hear, they don't want to hear that it's about adherence and how many calories you eat and all that kind of stuff. What they want to hear is do this special protocol that boosts your metabolism by 50%. Because for whatever reason, that shit's sexy to people. But I mean, maybe there's some small benefits towards metabolism and energy expenditure and lean body mass. But I think we need a lot more evidence before we can make that case strongly.
Yep. Okay. Last one in this category, cardio in building and gaining phase. Is that overrated or underrated?
10 years ago, I would have said, 5 years ago, I said overrated. 15 years ago, I said underrated. And now I'd say probably about right, to be honest. I think there are some benefits to doing cardio. I don't think it's going to help you build lean mass, but I don't think it's going to have a huge negative impact either, as long as the dosage is appropriate. I mean, if you're going out and you're running, 5 miles a day, yeah, it's probably going to have a negative impact towards strength and lean body mass. But, if you're wanting to hop on the bike, there was a time where I wouldn't even go for a bike ride because I was worried about it affecting my lifts. I think if the dosage is appropriate, it's fine. But I don't think it's underrated. I don't think it's overrated.
Okay, so properly rated.
Yeah.
Last category for our live, and is about this or that. So I'll give you 2 or 3 options, and you kind of choose what is your favorite one or the answer that is more appropriate. You may say, like, as usual, it depends, because everything depends here, but what would be your most likely answer? So the first one is, if you only can choose one thing in a very busy day and you're trying to lose fat and change your body composition, what would you choose? Would you choose resistance training, cardio,
resistance training,
or total?
Resistance.
What is that?
Don't need to say anything else. Resistance training, because you can get the benefits from cardio or anything else exercise-wise, but plus you get the benefit of lean body mass and strength and whatnot. So resistance training.
Okay, and if the case was your entire week is great, you are very, very busy, you're traveling, what would you choose if that's the only thing that you can do the entire week or entire month? Would you still choose resistance training?
If we're going to do, so it's all you can do, definitely choose resistance training, absolutely. But I mean, in a specific situation, it's different, right? Like if you're traveling for a day, you're run down, you didn't sleep well, but you've got to go into the gym. But no, you could go do, just get some steps in, cardio, whatever. But, on balance, I'm always going to pick resistance over, something else.
Okay. If you have cravings, should you satisfy your craving or ignore it and starve it?
I think that's really case dependent, especially for people who have a history of eating disorders. But I would say in general, you should try to satisfy it if you can satisfy it without going overboard. But you should also ask yourself, am I really hungry, or am I just queued up to eat something specific because I'm in a certain situation? I saw something the other day that said, if you're not hungry enough to eat some broccoli, you're not hungry, which I think may be a little bit triggering for some people with, eating disorder background. But generally, I do agree. I think most people eat not it's interesting. A lot of people like make a big deal about like the ketogenic diet or plant-based or intermittent fasting, whatever, and their impacts on hunger. Great. Hunger is not the only reason people eat. In fact, I would argue that anymore, hunger isn't even the main reason people eat. I think people eat because they're queued up to most times, or because of a stress response, or all other sorts of things. So this idea that, I'm hungry, I should eat. First, you should ask yourself, am I really hungry?
I usually teach my clients something that I think it stuck to me few years ago. If hunger is not the problem, food is not going to be the solution. So you gotta go and reflect what you really think the reason why you're trying to eat. Is it because you're actually feeling angry, lonely, or tired, and you're using food as to lift you up or to make you feel better? And know that if you do it, you can still allow yourself to have it, but is it worth it? Or is it really going to bring you the payoff for the goals that you're trying to achieve in the first place?
Yeah.
Okay. Active or passive recovery? What would you choose?
Probably active. Probably. I think there are some benefits to just resting and chilling the F out. But I think for the most part, when it's needed, but I think for the most part, the human body's meant to move. Unless you're talking about some kind of sport that's just incredibly demanding, I think active recovery is probably the ticket.
Okay. Protein pre-sleep. Casein, whey, or it doesn't really matter?
Doesn't really matter. I think, the area under the curve of protein synthesis and protein anabolism, it's going to be really similar between. In fact, people think of whey as a fast protein, and it's not really fast. It's actually pretty similar to most other proteins. It's just that casein is really slow.
Okay. Reverse dieting or recovery diet post-show? Oh, well, we already covered that one, so forget about that one. My last question would be, just completely out of the categories, upcoming plans, future projects. Tell me a little bit about what are you cooking?
Well, as you know, as a Team BioLayne coach, we've been expanding our team quite a bit. We've just brought on a couple more awesome coaches. And for those who don't know, Astrid is our one senior coach right now. So she has been amazing and absolutely killing it. And I just on this live, I would say, ever since our chat a few months ago, you've done amazing, and I'm really proud of you. So you're doing awesome. Team BioLayne's doing great. So really excited about that. As far as novel things coming up, obviously we're about to launch our completely redone website. So the workout builder has been completely redone. We're adding reps, which is research explained in practical summaries. That's going to be myself and James Longstrom, which is going to be basically a research review every month. We break down 5 studies relevant to nutrition and exercise, and we translate them into a palatable way for the average person. There's a lot of research. There's several research reviews out there. I think most of them are geared kind of towards scientists that just don't have time to read the studies. This is going to be very much geared towards the lay person. So it's going to be, even if you don't have a background in nutrition or exercise, you should be able to read this and still pick up some nuggets from it, which I think will be really helpful for a lot of people. So we've got that going. Obviously, Carbon is doing amazing. We're going to be releasing some new products for Outwork Nutrition as well. And then later this year, hopefully, Bill Campbell and I will be launching our Physique Coaching Academy, which is going to be a huge, huge project. So this has been almost 3 years in the making of writing this material, putting it together. And it's basically, if you were an online coach, there are there's nutrition certifications, there's personal training certifications, but there's nothing specific for I want to coach body composition, which is what most online coaches do, frankly. They try to help people lose fat and build muscle. This certification will be specific for that, and it is going to be in-depth. It's awesome. I've already read some of Bill's section. To give you an example, Bill's section on cardio for fat loss and its effects is 100 pages just on that. It is incredibly detailed, and I feel very confident in saying that this is going to be like the equivalent of kind of an associate's degree in body composition coaching. So I'm super excited for that. And of course, BioLane is going to have new stuff coming out all year as well. And we've got our second remodel coming up here in July. And I think that this is going to be by far our biggest remodel yet for coaching. I have a very sneaky suspicion that we're going to probably sign up over 200 clients. And I think our big goal, maybe not this year, but by next year, is I would love it if our team could service, over 1,000 people in a year. I think that would be an incredible milestone for us. And so really, our mission statement is just to use ethical, evidence-based methods to help people get to their goals and to really, help people realize that this stuff doesn't have to be that complicated, and to really simplify it down, because this whole industry is so confusing to people. And I want us to be like the voice of sanity and positivity and make people feel like their goals are actually achievable without having to do crazy shit. So I'm feeling very good about where our company's headed, and you've been a big part of that, which we're very grateful for.
Thank you so much. Well, I am looking forward to all of these things. I am going to see you in June. So I am so pumped to see and meet all the team. And also, I just want to give you all like big hugs and like, oh my God, finally, this is going to be happening. Is there something that you would tell the audience to go and sleep with the nice and refreshed takeaway from dieting, fat loss? Something that you just want them to understand, a very simple message.
Listen, the stuff that works is the stuff that's always worked. It's about consistency. It's about doing the work. And, obstacles are normal. Stress is normal. Frustration is normal. That's all normal. None of that stuff is unique or weird. And just know that, like, if you're having a hard time with this stuff, you're not alone. A lot of people struggle with this stuff. But it can be done. Don't throw in the towel. The fact that it is hard is what will make it rewarding for you. Unless I was listening to a podcast today, and it is so interesting that in order for something to feel rewarding for us, it has to feel difficult. That is absolutely 100% true. If something is easy, we do not value it. We don't value it. If like the parents get a nice car when he turns 16, what does the kid do? He trashes it because he didn't have to earn it. The stuff we earn is the stuff we value. So instead of taking this as, this is so hard, I hate how hard it is, take it as, whenever I achieve this, it's going to feel so much more rewarding for me because I had to do all this. So that is how I've reframed stuff with, like, for example, I've gone through a lot of injuries in powerlifting. So let me give you all an example, because I got to jump off here in a few minutes. I've had 2 herniated discs in my lower back. I've had 2 bulge discs in my lower back. I've torn a muscle in both hips. I've had 2 herniated discs in my cervical spine. I have partially torn my left pec and fully torn my right pec, which required surgery and an 18-month rehab. Which only means that when I've accomplished things in powerlifting, it's been that much more sweet, because I had to go through hell to get it. So, as Winston Churchill used to say, if you're going through hell, keep going.
You're competing soon, right?
I have Masters Nationals in about 5.5 weeks.
Ooh, well, I wish you all the best with that. I know you are going to kill it, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you so much for coming.
We'll see you in a few weeks.
I see you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.